Hello. Well, we're going to give this video for chapter 1 in Extreme Economies a second try. I'm not sure exactly what happened with the first one. It might have been a little bit too long and the file a little bit too large to upload. So I'll try to be a little bit more concise this time. And that could convey certain benefits all the way around. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And these are the PowerPoint slides that I constructed for chapter 1 in your text. I'm going to go ahead and make those full screen. There we go. And I would just like to walk through these and make some observations. These are the principles or some of the principles that are typically covered in an introductory course that I thought was most relevant to the content of chapter 1. And the first item happens to be the short run and long run impacts of disasters, such as the tsunami that struck Aceh in 2004, that is described in chapter 1 of your text. What are the short run and the long run impacts of such an event on both demand and supply? Let me just step back for just a minute and explain exactly what we're talking about in economics when we use those two terms, demand and supply. With demand, we're talking about an entire relationship between price or the price of a good or service and the quantity demanded, the amount of that good or service that people want to buy. We assume that that is a negative relationship, meaning other things being equal, holding constant everything that could possibly everything else that could possibly impact demand. When the price is relatively high, the amount that people want to buy is relatively low. It might even be zero. When the price is relatively low, the amount that people want to buy goes up. But there are also factors other than price that will cause the whole demand schedule to shift, to increase or decrease. And I'll get to those in just a minute. The assumption that we make with supply, on the other hand, we also assume that this is an entire relationship between price and quantity supplied, but we make a completely opposite assumption. We assume that as the price rises, again, other things held constant, the quantity supplied, the amount that producers want to sell or the amount that businesses want to produce, is going to go up. So at very low prices, the quantity supplied is going to be very low. It might even be zero. We see this in labor markets, for example, where an employer might advertise a certain type of employment, and if the wage or the salary is not high enough to be interesting, they may have no applicants whatsoever. But as the price rises, we assume that the quantity supplied goes up. It becomes more interesting to sell, just as it becomes less interesting to buy. And just as with the case, as is the case with demand, there are other factors other than supply, which will cause this, other than price, that will cause the supply schedule to either increase or to decrease. And that's really what I would like to get to now. So when we have a disaster, such as the one described in your text, and such as some of the ones that unfortunately we have observed both in the United States and around the world just in very recent times, there is the short run effect on demand is that the demand for certain goods and services rises because there is a need to rebuild that which was damaged or that which was destroyed, in this case, as a result of the storm. Now, in some cases, that may be financed by internal resources. It might be financed by borrowing in the capital and financial markets. It might be financed by, as was described in chapter 1, outside aid or outside assistance, whether it comes from governments, whether it comes from multilateral organizations or from private voluntary organizations. So demand goes up for certain goods and services in order to rebuild, and supply goes down because some of the existing productive capacity that was there before has either been damaged or perhaps has been destroyed. The long run impact is quite different, particularly on the supply side. because once this rebuilding process, this reconstruction process has taken place, the supply of goods and services can once again be restored. And in fact, as your author describes in chapter 1, it might even be more productive. It might even be more efficient than what existed previously. To use a phrase that's become a part of our public discourse in the United States, there's an opportunity to build back better as a result of that need to reinvest. The second point that I just wanted to touch on is the relevance of location and geography. We have sometimes heard in this current era of globalization, international economic integration, that location, physical location, and geography is not as important as it used to be in previous periods of global economic history. And while that may be the case, I think your author makes a very persuasive case that Ate, that particular location, has benefited for hundreds of years from its particular location on the globe. And I would just like to give you another example of where that's the case. I have taught for some years during the summer months in the International Business Institute program. That's a summer study abroad program. It's based at Messiah University in Pennsylvania, but both George Fox and my institution, Olivet Nazarene, are affiliated with the IBI program. That means students from our institutions are also eligible to participate. And some years ago, our program itinerary used to start in the Baltic nation of Lithuania. And one of our first corporate or organizational visits was to the port of Klaipėda. Klaipėda is located on the Baltic Sea, and that port is a significant economic asset. For one reason, it is the only port on the entire Baltic Sea that is open 12 months out of the year. It does not freeze over during the wintertime. But secondly, Klaipėda has a very, very strategic location. Our hosts at the port of Klaipėda used to oftentimes say that it was where east meets west meets north. In other words, it was connected by both sea and rail to the markets of Western, Central, and Eastern Europe. It was also connected to the markets of the Russian Federation and the other former Soviet republics, and in fact, via rail, all the way to China. And it was also connected to the Scandinavian nations of the North. So this was a tremendous advantage for that particular port. And I think we see some of this reflected in your chapter as well. Formal versus informal markets. Let me just take a minute to define exactly what I mean by that. So if a business operates in a formal market, that means it is officially recognized and registered. It has obtained all the licenses and the permits and the certifications that it may need to operate. It also means that its property rights and its ownership rights are likely to be defined and enforced by the government. An informal market, by contrast, consists of the same type of market and commercial activity, but yet we're talking about situations where it's not necessarily legally recognized or registered or certified, if for no other reason than in some parts of the world, the cost associated with those kinds of permits and licenses may be prohibitive for the business people, for the entrepreneurs that are trying to pursue that type of commercial enterprise. So your author makes the case that in Ate's situation, informal markets, informal means of engaging in commercial activity may have been a significant advantage in terms of this whole rebuilding and reconstruction process. And without trying to contradict that, I would say that I did want to point out that there are benefits to formality and there are limitations associated with informality. And those are discussed very well in a book that I have in my office, and I'm going to hold up here so you can see it. It was published about 20 years ago by the Peruvian economist Hernando de Soto, entitled The Mystery of Capital. And in that book, Mr. de Soto discusses at length the significance of private property rights that are well defined and well enforced, and what happens when there are those present. He recognizes when they're not present. He recognizes the importance of informal commerce in many parts of the world, particularly in poorer parts of the world. That is a major part of commercial market and business activity. But de Soto argues that there are limitations to being informal. Let's suppose that you want to go into the financial markets or the capital markets to, borrow funds, take out loans in order to expand or to modernize your business. That's going to be really, really difficult, because how can you prove that you really own that business? What's going to be the security? What's going to be the collateral on this particular loan? So de Soto argues that much of what takes place around the world in informal markets is not illegal. He uses the term extra legal. It's just outside the officially recognized legally protected economy, and it's valuable commercial activity, but there are also many limitations associated with it as well. And so that can be a limiting factor to their future. Fourth point, physical versus human capital. When disasters take place, much of what is destroyed, much of what has to be replaced or rebuilt is physical capital. Bricks and mortar, what in this day and age we sometimes refer to as infrastructure, and that's very important. But your author, Richard Davies, I think makes a pretty good argument in chapter 1 that the most important, or maybe a more important dimension of capital might be what economists have referred to for decades as human capital. That's a metaphor or figure of speech to refer to the skills and talents and abilities and knowledge of people. And I think Davies makes a case in chapter 1 that not only is that a perhaps more significant form of capital, but particularly in situations where rebuilding needs to be taking place, reinvestment needs to be taking place. It's physical capital can be rebuilt. What's important is that people have the skills and the knowledge to know how to do that once they obtain the resources and once they obtain the financing. And then finally, point number 5, the relevance of culture. And I would just kind of try to leave that with you as an open question. If we're thinking about the existence of disasters of various types and how the rebuilding process takes place, what is the relative relevance of economic factors? What's the relative relevance of political factors? And then finally, what is the relevance of culture? Okay, and I'm going to leave that for you to consider in the context of your discussion board question for this week, which I have written and which is posted in Canvas. And of course, I'd be glad to answer any questions you might have about that during the course of this week. As you'll see, that question is a spin-off. It's a bit of an expansion of the question that's up here on the PowerPoint slide, which comes right out of chapter 1. Would the pressure of rebuilding exacerbate existing divisions in Ate, or would the challenge bring people together? That's a question for us to consider in our own time in the wake of the global pandemic, but I think it's also relevant here as well. So thank you for your attention and for your patience. Please let me know if you have any questions about the topics for this week and those in the future. One thing that I wanted to add to this video that I meant to mention in my Canvas announcement this morning but I forgot to do so, is that you do have your first writing assignment coming up at the end of next week. I believe the due date is Friday, September 17th. So I'm starting to think about that, and I will get you more information about that as soon as possible.